Genetic evidence suggests humans started wearing clothes somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago, tracked not through fabric, which doesn't survive that long, but through the DNA of body lice, an insect that can only live in clothing. Let that sink in. We know when we got dressed by studying parasites that needed us to start. Everyone assumes ancient humans invented clothes because they were cold. That's wrong. Almost completely wrong. Or at least it's wrong as a starting explanation, because by the time clothing shows up in the genetic record, humans had already been naked, genuinely, fully naked, no fur at all, for over 1 million years. Through ice ages, through freezing nights, through entire glacial periods. So if cold alone was enough to invent clothing, the obvious question is, what took so long? Here's where the story actually starts, and it starts with hair. Somewhere around 1 to 2 million years ago, early humans lost most of their body hair. Not gradually shed like a seasonal molt, evolutionarily lost permanently, replaced with millions of sweat glands instead. You've probably heard this framed as an adaptation for endurance running, for persistence hunting, for chasing prey across open savanna until it collapsed from heat exhaustion. That part's true. Sweating works better on bare skin, but losing your fur to run better in the heat creates an entirely new problem the moment the sun goes down or the season turns. You've just traded thermoregulation for exposure, and for over 1 million years that trade-off apparently didn't bother anyone enough to fix it. This is the part that should genuinely stop you. A full 1 million years of bare-skinned humans surviving cold nights, harsh winters, entire ice ages, with nothing but their own skin. No clothing. Not because they didn't need it, they clearly did, but because, as far as the evidence shows, nobody had made it yet. So let's go back to the lice, because the lice are doing more work here than a weird trivia fact. Body lice, unlike head lice or pubic lice, cannot survive without fabric. They lay their eggs in the seams of clothing, not in hair, which means the moment body lice evolve as a distinct species, separate from head lice, is the moment clothing had to already exist for them to evolve into. Geneticists Ralph Kittler, Manfred Kayser, and Mark Stoneking used the mutation rate between head lice and body lice DNA like a molecular clock. And the clock says clothing shows up sometime in that 170,000 to 83,000 year window, not earlier. The parasite couldn't have appeared earlier because its habitat, our clothes, didn't exist yet. Now here's the reframe. That window doesn't line up with the coldest period humans experienced. It lines up with something else entirely: migration. Homo sapiens began pushing out of Africa and into colder, higher latitude environments. Europe, Central Asia, eventually Siberia, roughly within that same time frame, which means clothing likely wasn't a response to cold that people were already living in. It was the technology that let people walk into cold they hadn't survived before. Not a reaction, an unlock. This is where anthropologist Ian Gilligan's research gets genuinely interesting. Gilligan has argued that early clothing probably wasn't even about warmth first. It may have started as loose wrapped hides, not for insulation, but for carrying things, for protecting skin during travel, for status, for marking who belonged to which group. Functional insulation, the tailored, fitted, actually warm version of clothing, came later, as a second-stage technology layered on top of something that started as a much simpler tool. And that tracks with everything else we know about how ancient humans behaved. Ornamentation, beads, pigment, deliberately shaped shells worn on the body, shows up in the archaeological record around the same window, sometimes even earlier, which suggests something a little uncomfortable for anyone who wants a tidy survival-first story. Humans may have been dressing to be seen before they were dressing to stay warm. The practical benefit came along for the ride. Think about what that actually implies. A wrapped hide slung over the shoulder does two things at once without any extra effort. It keeps you a little warmer, sure, but it also tells everyone around the fire something about you, what you hunted, what your group values, who you are relative to everyone else standing there. Status and survival bundled into the same object, invented at the same moment, for reasons that probably weren't even separable in the mind of whoever made the first one. We like clean categories. Ancient humans, as usual, weren't cooperating with our need for clean categories. Compare Neanderthals here, because the comparison is instructive. Neanderthals lived in genuinely brutal cold for hundreds of thousands of years, and they clearly used hides. The wear patterns on their stone scrapers prove it. But there's no evidence they used eyed needles. No evidence of tailored, fitted, sewn clothing the way Homo sapiens eventually developed it. Neanderthal cold weather gear was almost certainly draped and wrapped, not stitched to the body. Homo sapiens, by contrast, developed bone needles with actual eyes drilled through them somewhere around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, allowing tight seams, layered garments, clothing that trapped heat instead of just blocking wind. That difference might sound small. It wasn't. Tailored clothing is very plausibly one of the technologies that let Homo sapiens push into environments Neanderthals never reached. The genuinely extreme cold of Ice Age Siberia, and eventually the Arctic. Not better bodies, better gear. A population of physically unremarkable primates walked into some of the harshest climates on the planet. Not because their skin adapted to the cold, but because they built something that adapted for them. Archaeologists working sites in Siberia have found evidence consistent with fitted, layered clothing at settlements dated to around 30,000 years ago. Multiple garment layers, insulated footwear, hoods. This wasn't a hide thrown over the shoulders anymore. This was engineered. Someone had figured out that trapping a layer of warm air against skin worked better than simply blocking wind, and once that idea existed, it spread, because the groups who had it could go places the groups without it couldn't survive. Which is really the whole point. Once you step back, clothing isn't just fabric. It's one of the earliest examples of humans outsourcing biological adaptation onto technology instead of waiting for evolution to catch up. Fur evolves over hundreds of thousands of years. A sewn hide takes an afternoon. Once humans figured out they could build the adaptation instead of growing it, geography stopped being a limit. You didn't need thick fur to survive Siberia. You needed a needle, a hide, and someone patient enough to use them. So the honest answer to why ancient humans started wearing clothes isn't cold exactly, and it isn't fashion exactly, and it isn't practicality exactly. It's some tangled, inconvenient mix of all three, showing up at almost exactly the same evolutionary moment, which is usually how the real story goes when you actually look instead of assume. The lice remember the date, the needles remember the method. Nobody left behind a note explaining the reason, so we're left reconstructing motive from parasites and sewing tools, which is either the strangest form of historical evidence imaginable or the most honest one. What do you think actually came first for your ancestors? Staying warm or being seen?